I would like to thank Wesley UMC and Mr. and Mrs. Tsukamoto and their committee and Reverend Yamamoto for planning and hosting this event, a very significant event. And I'm truly honored to be asked to be one of the speakers today. Toward a nuclear-free world. The topic is very dear to me, to my heart, all my life. So I'm truly honored to speak about it today. I was born on December 25th, 1944. I was a Christmas baby. 1944, 8 months before the bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. I was born in Sasebo, Nagasaki, which was more than 20 miles away from the ground zero in Nagasaki. When the bomb was dropped, I was only 8 months old. So I have no personal recollection of the devastating, hellish devastation unfolding in the city of Nagasaki, where people are crushed under the fallen buildings, and the whole city was engulfed in a tremendous fireball, whose temperature is as high as the interior of the sun. Therefore, most of the living organizations that were exposed to the fireball immediately or evaporated, and many people were severely burned and crying for water. I have no personal memory of these events. The effect of the nuclear bombing was not limited to the blast or fire, but more deceptive and insidious effect was the radiation fallout, which was invisible, tasteless. People didn't notice it. When the bomb was detonated, fallout was spread into the atmosphere, blown by the wind, and came down back to Earth in the form of rain, and contaminating the water in the city reservoir, and also everything we ate. The vegetables and the fish we ate were contaminated. So air we breathed, water we drank, the food we ate were all contaminated. Once the radiation got into the body, it stayed inside the bone marrow, destroying the immune system. And as a result, people died of leukemia and all kinds of cancer and so forth. Much like the AIDS, the symptoms are very much like AIDS, human immunodeficiency. Was also caused by radiation. As far back as I can recall, both my mother and my sister were sick in bed, looking pale. And I have no recollection of their standing up. I thought they were always flat. When my father came back from the war, he was last stationed in Taiwan as an interpreter, as a Navy officer. He removed all of us from the area and moved to Kumamoto and later on Nagasaki, where my mother died, and soon afterwards my sister died. Both died of leukemia. when my sister died, my father asked the doctor, what will happen to the rest of the family? And the doctor said, your youngest, me, would have been most vulnerable to the radiation if he was exposed to the same amount of radiation. He may not live to see his 10th birthday. I was only 6 then. And I didn't know how to process it. I was too young to know what that meant. So for some reason, I stopped talking. All my neighbors thought I was mute. And neighbors would be surprised to see me being a preacher. But anyway, I don't know how long that symptom continued. But fortunately, I was not as physically affected by the radiation. But the psychological effect really tortured me. It's called survivor's guilt. And I tested it with all my hibakusha friends, and as well as the American survivors of the radiation. They all testified to the fact that they all suffered from survivor's guilt. Why did the good people like my mother and my sister have to die so early when I, good-for-nothing kid, is still alive? That affected my personality completely. I became introvert, extremely introverted, and withdrawn. Also, there was a great deal of prejudice against the hibakusha. They used to say, if you have a woman in your family or a young girl in the family, nobody would marry you because the child your girl will be deformed, which didn't happen, but there was a rumor. So to protect my sister, we had another sister in the family, so we tried to keep the fact that we were near Nagasaki when the bomb fell secret to protect my sister from the prejudice. I was totally relieved when I became 10, the year when I was supposed to die. A few years later, my brother died of unknown disease at the age of 42. And doctors didn't know what to make of it, so they performed an autopsy, and they found the internal organ and all the veins were prematurely aged. And it may not have anything to do with the radiation, but in my mind, I always wondered. So I didn't know sometime soon I might become ill of radiation. In 1979, when I was a pastor in Alameda, I met Kanji Kuramoto, who was the president of the Atomic Bomb Survivors USA. And together with him, I organized a group called Friends of Hibakusha. This basically, we brought together the volunteers, mostly social workers and community workers, to work with hibakusha, local hibakusha. We had about 700 hibakshas in the area. And we formed a support group for the survivors. And through the organization, I met many survivors, and they're all saying how lucky those who were killed in the blast and in the fire were, because they didn't have to put up with all the illnesses that they experienced. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki were rudimentary ones. Hiroshima bomb using uranium-235 was designed to produce the explosive power of 15 kilotons of TNT explosive. But the Nagasaki bomb using plutonium-239 was to release the explosive power of 22 kilotons. They were like toys compared to the ones we have today. Most of the thermonuclear bombs in the United States are at least 1.2 megatons, 1,200,000 tons of TNT explosive. Yet those small bombs caused in Hiroshima and Nagasaki the combined casualties of approximately 214,000 people. According to the Japanese government tabulation. Of course, the American estimate is much less than half of it. 105,000 casualties. Either way, the numbers did not include the people like my mother and my sister who did not live within the city limit. And soon after the war, they removed themselves from the radiation-infested area to another cities where they died. The early nuclear bombs, like the ones dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, used the splitting of atoms, or called fission, to produce energy. Modern hydrogen bombs use the fission process as a trigger mechanism to ignite a fusion process in hydrogen isotopes. It is called thermonuclear bombs. And it leads to an explosive power thousands of times more than the early fission system. The largest bomb in existence is a Russian bomb called Zabomba, which is 50 megaton. 50 megaton, if they drop that bomb in Japan, the whole Japanese archipelago will be gone. During the Cold War, not just the United States and Soviet Union, but 21 other nations, including UK, China, France, Israel, India, Pakistan, Brazil, South Africa, Iran, Iraq, Egypt, and some others, joined the nuclear race. At the height of the Cold War in 1968, the world possessed 65,000 nuclear warheads, and 97% of them belonged to either the Soviet Union or the United States. Following the end of the Cold War, all the US presidents negotiated with the Soviet or Russian leaders and came up with the bilateral nuclear arms reduction treaties. Now the world stockpiles have been reduced to 1/2 of what it used to be, although the level is still much too high. If an unstable leader of an unstable state pushes the button and launches a barrage of nuclear missiles, the opposing state would also retaliate and the result would be a global disaster. We all remember the so-called Cuban crisis when President Kennedy was the president. I know how close we came to the nuclear war at that time. As recent as 1995, the Russian military mistook Norwegian weather research rocket for an American nuclear missile. And they brought to President Boris Yeltsin the nuclear briefcase with a button to launch a nuclear missiles. He was ready to push the button, and in the nick of the time, they found that it was not a nuclear missile, but just a weather rocket. This kind of human errors can repeat themselves easily. Philosopher Martin Heidegger once said, "I am not concerned about nuclear weapons as such, but I'm scared of the fact that it's the humans who hold the nuclear weapons." The United States began nuclear programs codenamed Manhattan Project in 1942 at the urging of the German scientists who knew that Nazi Germany was developing nuclear weapons. The Manhattan Project produced the first atom bombs and dropped them on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. Having found its devastating power, many scientists involved in the Manhattan Project pleaded with the President Truman, to discontinue the nuclear program. They saw what could happen. However, President Truman decided to continue the program, hoping that it would serve as a deterrent. Although it was meant to be a deterrent, American nuclear bomb triggered the chain reaction throughout the world. In response to the US, the Soviet Union began to develop their own nuclear weapons and succeeded in 3 years. When the Soviet nuclear threat was felt in Europe, the United Kingdom detonated their first nuclear weapons in 1952. And in 1960, France also detonated their first nuclear bomb. China felt threatened by the US nuclear capabilities, and later by the Soviets, began their own nuclear research and development program and successfully detonated their first nuclear bomb in 1964. In 10 years, 5 nations possessed the nuclear weapons. Threatened by China's nuclear capabilities, both India and Pakistan tested their first nuclear bombs in 1998. Israel has not admitted the possession of nuclear weapons, but it's widely known that their program began before the Six-Day War of 1964 and is believed to possess at least 80 nuclear warheads. Israel's acquisition of nuclear weapons triggered the regional chain reaction throughout the Middle East. Libya, Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Egypt began their nuclear research. Libya was the first to realize that abandoning their nuclear aspiration was much preferable to economic sanctions. So did Egypt. Iraq also gave up their nuclear program, and IAEA, International Atomic Energy Agency, certified that they had discontinued the nuclear program, but the United States did not trust them. Instead of waiting for definitive result, they went in, attacked Iraq, hoping to overthrow Saddam Hussein and destroy their nuclear facilities. When the US entered Iraq, however, no nuclear facility was found anywhere in Iraq. American invasion of Iraq under a false pretense gave rise to radical anti-American terrorist groups such as ISIS. In the so-called Iran nuclear deal of 2015, Iran agreed to give up their nuclear program in exchange for lifting the international sanctions against them. The agreement included accepting the inspection by IAEA, International Atomic Energy Agency, to make sure they abide by the agreement. President Trump, however, did not trust Iran and unilaterally canceled the deal, but has not started a negotiation with them yet. One obvious reason for nations to aspire to acquire nuclear arsenals, as I have mentioned, is their national security. Another reason is the international prestige. The UK and France wanted to restore their prestige, which they lost when they no longer had their colonies. They aspired to restore their former prestige and demonstrate their power by becoming nuclear weapon states. North Korea also sought prestige by joining the exclusive nuclear states club so that they can stand on the same footing with the United States to negotiate the end of the Korean War. Can you believe that the Korean War has not ended? And no wonder North Korea feels threatened by the US. No wonder they had to develop something to counter the American aggression. Russia is doing the same thing for prestige. Ever since the fall of the Soviet Union, Russia has experienced a dramatic downfall in economy. The size of Russian economy is less than 1/2 of that of the state of California. And yet they have the most number of the nuclear warheads. Russia, because their land is so vast, they're not taking care of their nuclear sites. And it has been reported that they have been missing some nuclear weapons materials. And it's been said that they have been stolen by the terrorist groups. Also, there's a nuclear black market in Afghanistan and Pakistan. There is some evidence that Osama bin Laden had negotiated with a Pakistani nuclear scientist and nuclear black market suspect, A.Q. Khan. If the reasons for nations' aspiration for nuclear arsenals is national security, then we can perhaps find other ways to assure national security. We should remember that a common sense that true national security is not achieved by military means, but by diplomacy and by adhering to the international treaties and institutions. If they want nuclear weapons for international prestige, we need to create a consensus that true prestige is achieved not by amassing nuclear arsenals, by giving up the nuclear arsenals to make sure that they formed peaceful relations with one another. There's one more thing. We have known that among the states where democracy is functioning well, there has not been any war. On the other hand, there have been wars when democracy falls and autocracy or dictatorship takes its place. If that's true, we must value democracy more, work harder to make sure healthy democracy prevails. Prior to the tragedy of 9/11, a political ideology called neocon, some of you remember the word neocon, neoconservatism, promoted by such scholars or politicians as Dr. Daniel Bell of Harvard, Dr. Paul Wolfowitz of the World Bank, Vice President Dick Cheney, Secretary of Defense Daniel Rumsfeld, and President Trump's current National Security Advisor, John Bolton. They believe that the U.S. should advocate for nuclear non-proliferation, but for the United States, they wanted to maintain nuclear supremacy because they believe that by the peace of the world can be better secured by the American military supremacy instead of international treaty. President Bush was not necessarily one of the neocons, but he believed there was an axis of evil comprised of Iran, Iraq, and North Korea. The neocons' first target was Iraq. Saddam Hussein's dictatorship was obviously oppressive. They had a history of nuclear ambition. The U.S. decided to attack Iraq preemptively to achieve regime change before Saddam Hussein could use weapons of mass destruction. Probably nuclear. When the U.S. troops entered Iraq, however, there was no nuclear facility anywhere. The neocons' next targets were Iran and North Korea, but the Bush-Cheney administration was replaced by President Obama's. Thus, neocon campaign was halted. U.S. invasion of Iraq had an unexpected adverse result, as it gave rise to the radical anti-American terrorism. Unlike Bush administration, President Obama's policy involved seeking international consensus and supporting treaties and institutions of peace. Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, NPT, went into effect in 1970. It was a huge victory for all peace-loving people in the world. As of now, 191 states have ratified and signed the treaty. The only states that did not join the treaty were Israel, India, and Pakistan. North Korea later left the treaty. Before the treaty, there were 23 states that had nuclear weapons programs. But after the treaty, there were only 9 nuclear weapons states. Among the states that signed the treaty, those who did not have nuclear weapons promised never to seek nuclear weapons. And those who already had them promised to reduce their stockpiles and to work toward the eventual elimination of nuclear arsenals. I believe we all need to make every effort to support the NPT and promote international diplomacy and cultural and educational exchange, both at governmental and the citizens' level. We must be diligent to speak up that no civilized states should tolerate such weapons of mass destruction. Almost every year, either on August 9th or 6th, I have participated and spoken at the anti-nuclear weapons rally in front of the National Nuclear Laboratory in Livermore. Those who gather at Livermore are getting old. And from the platform, I looked down, and almost everyone had a white hair. And young people's participation is very scarce. What that means is there's a lack of sense of urgency among the young people about the nuclear threat. But there are reasons to be concerned. Russia this year deployed hypersonic ICBM. What that means is that no interception missiles can catch up with their ICBM to shoot it down. In other words, the United States is defenseless against the Russian ICBM, intercontinental ballistic missiles. Also, our president has made it clear that he differs from the previous administrations, that the nuclear weapons is for deterrence only. But he made it clear that we could have the first use of nuclear weapons against any countries. Our government has published the American Nuclear Posture Review 2018. It criticized the previous administration for not spending adequate funds to prepare for the nuclear threats from Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea, and emphasizes that nuclear weapons are now considered an important part of the U.S. defense strategy. This is the first administration since John F. Kennedy's that openly advocates for more nuclear weapons. Pentagon has announced that they plan to spend $500 billion in the next 10 years to modernize the U.S. nuclear arsenals. Do you realize that the U.S. has already spent $7.2 trillion for nuclear defense systems since Manhattan Project? You might appreciate how much that is if you know that U.S. national budget for 2019 is $4.4 trillion. American contribution to nuclear non-proliferation should not be by its nuclear supremacy, but by promoting the idea that no civilized state, including the United States, should possess nuclear weapons, and by supporting and adhering to the international commitment to non-proliferation regime. In 2017, the Nobel Peace Prize was awarded to the citizens group International Campaign for Abolition of Nuclear Weapons, ICAN, which is a broad coalition of non-government organizations. The same year, the United Nations passed TPNW, Treaty to Prohibit Nuclear Weapons, for signing. At present, 70 states have signed it. There appears to be a growing consensus in the international community to abolish nuclear weapons. These are some of the hopeful signs that help us keep the vision of a nuclear-free world. But we must remain committed and vigilant to do all we can until the last nuclear weapons is dismantled. Thank you.